Greetings, dear friends, and welcome once again to our quiet corner of the night, where we settle into soft blankets of reflection and allow the stories of the past to carry us gently toward rest. Tonight, we step back more than a century to a lakeside village where the shadows of childhood ran deeper than most, and where a boy would grow into a man who spent his entire life trying to understand the strange, hidden terrain inside every human soul. Picture, if you will, the Swiss countryside in the final decades of the 19th century. Rolling green hills rise softly around Lake Constance, their slopes dotted with farms, small parsonages, and quiet graveyards where the villagers rest beneath modest stones. The world here moves at a gentle pace, church bells marking the hours, lanterns flickering in kitchen windows at dusk, and the water of the lake reflecting the clouds like a polished mirror. It was into this peaceful yet spiritually charged landscape that Carl Gustav Jung was born. From the beginning, Carl's life seemed divided between two worlds, one outward, ordinary, and familiar, the other inward, mysterious, and filled with presences he could not yet name. His father, Paul Jung, was the local pastor, a scholarly man of good intentions but fragile faith. His sermons were earnest, his pastoral duties dutifully performed. Yet inside, Paul wrestled with doubts that gnawed at him quietly, wearing him down year after year. Carl would watch his father sit late into the evening with ancient books open before him, staring into their pages as though hoping the ink itself might reveal answers that theology no longer could. Even as a boy, Carl sensed the hollow places inside his father, felt the trembling uncertainty behind the words he preached each Sunday. His mother, Emily, was another presence entirely. Warm and affectionate at times, she was also unpredictable, often slipping into strange moods as night fell. When darkness settled over the parsonage, her voice would change, growing distant, almost echoing, as if someone else were speaking through her. Young Carl would lie awake in his small bedroom, watching the moonlight crawl across the ceiling while he listened to the faint, unsettling murmurs of his mother talking to someone who wasn't there. She would later insist that spirits visited her in the night, and although Carl did not know what to believe, the atmosphere of the house taught him early that the boundary between seen and unseen was thin. So thin, it could be pierced at any moment. Already by the age of 9 or 10, Jung began to feel himself split into what he later called personality number 1 and personality number 2. Personality number 1 was the boy everyone else saw, shy, awkward, trying his best to behave properly, though constantly overwhelmed by a sense that something vast and dark lay just outside his awareness. Personality number 2 was older, wiser, and impossibly ancient. When this presence stirred inside him, Carl felt as though he were not a child at all, but a distinguished old man wearing a powdered wig, sitting in a grand, ivy-covered house far from the simplicity of rural Switzerland. This inner figure was calm, dignified, and utterly certain. Everything the rest of Carl's world was not. It was not imagination in the carefree, playful sense. It was a genuine division within him, as though an invisible doorway existed somewhere deep inside his mind, and he crossed through it without warning. This secret duality frightened him, but it also fascinated him, becoming the central mystery of his early life, the feeling that he was far more than the self he presented to others. Even outside his inner world, the world Carl inhabited was full of strange, almost supernatural experiences. He felt presences in their home, shifts in the air, soft creaks in the hallway when everyone was asleep, sudden chills that passed through him like whispers. Doors would open or close on their own. Footsteps seemed to echo from empty rooms. and shadows moved just slightly too deliberately along the walls. His mother insisted these were spirits, restless souls with messages for the living. To cope with the fear, Carl created a small wooden figure, a tiny man he carved from a ruler, which he placed inside a pencil box and hid in the attic. Alongside it, he placed a smooth river stone he had found along the Rhine. This little secret companion became a private sanctuary, a mysterious anchor in a world that often felt too large, too strange, and too haunted. I have a secret, he felt, and this secret is the foundation of my being. The small figure symbolized safety, continuity, and something sacred that belonged to him alone, long before he ever spoke of the archetypes and symbols that would define his adult theories. His school years were equally marked by strangeness. He was intelligent, observant, and capable of absorbing vast amounts of information, yet he often collapsed under emotional pressure. Once, after being knocked down by another boy, Carl fainted so completely that he remained unconscious for hours. This incident sparked a realization that would affect his school life for years. If he fainted, he avoided conflict and expectations. And so, entirely unconsciously, fainting became a psychological shield. Teachers expressed concern, doctors were baffled, and Carl quietly recognized the frightening power of the mind to shape the body, an insight he would carry into his future career. Then came the moment that changed everything. At the age of 12, Jung experienced a vision so disturbing he refused to speak of it until adulthood. On a bright summer day, as he walked through Basel, admiring the majestic cathedral rising against the blue sky, an intrusive image forced itself into his mind. God, seated above the cathedral, releasing a torrent of divine excrement upon the holy building. He battled this vision for days, terrified that allowing it to unfold would condemn him to eternal punishment. But when he finally surrendered to it, expecting damnation, he felt instead an overwhelming wave of peace. In that moment, he realized that the sacred and the profane were not separate realms. They were entwined, reflections of a deeper truth that religion seldom acknowledged. Something had shattered inside him, but something else had awakened. This was the beginning of his understanding that the human soul was not governed by simple notions of good and evil, darkness and light, purity and filth, holiness and sin. These were not opposites, but twins, and within each person lived both. As Jung grew older, his relationship with his father deteriorated. Paul Jung, exhausted by doubt and spiritual dryness, seemed to Carl like a warning, a man who could not face the darkness inside himself, and therefore could not live fully. When his father died in 1896, Carl felt not only grief, but a deep sense of unfinished business, as though his father's unanswered questions had passed directly into his hands. He resolved that he would never accept shallow explanations or hide from difficult truths. If the human mind contained darkness, he would face it. If God contained contradictions, he would accept them. And if the psyche was larger, stranger, and more ancient than anyone imagined, he would explore it. During his university years, Jung became increasingly consumed by questions of spirit, symbolism, and the unseen depths of consciousness. While his fellow medical students pursued conventional studies, he gravitated toward the edges of respectability, attending seances, studying psychic phenomena, and analyzing trance states. His professors laughed, unimpressed, but Jung sensed something profound behind these events. The first hints of the collective unconscious, long before he had words to describe it. By the time he completed his degree in medicine and psychiatry in 1900, the haunted child had grown into a young man standing at the threshold of a profession that knew almost nothing about the deep inner life. Psychiatry at the turn of the century treated the mind as a malfunctioning machine, something to be restrained, corrected, or ignored. But Jung knew better. He had lived inside the mysteries the mind could produce. He had visited its shadows, felt its presences, and survived its storms. He was not afraid of the abyss. In fact, he was ready to enter it. And standing just ahead was the place where his journey would truly begin. A towering institution overlooking Lake Zurich, filled with the broken, the lost, and the forgotten. Burg Hölzli, a new world, a new chapter, and the beginning of the life that would redefine how humanity understands the psyche itself. Part 2, The Prodigy of Burg Hölzli, 1900-1909. The haunted child had become a haunted young man, carrying within him all the unresolved mysteries of his childhood, all the questions his father had been too frightened to confront. And as Jung stepped into the next phase of his life, his arrival at the Burg Hölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, he carried with him not only the weight of his past, but a fierce determination to understand the human mind in ways no one before him had dared to attempt. Burg Hölzli was not just any psychiatric institution. It was the beating heart of early modern psychiatry, a place where the boundaries of science and the unknowable were constantly being tested. Perched above Lake Zurich, its halls echoed with the cries, whispers, and laughter of patients whose minds had slipped beyond what society called sanity. The building itself was a strange mix of order and chaos. White lab coats and clinical instruments contrasted harshly with the unpredictable, often desperate reality of those who lived behind its doors. For Jung, Burg Hölzli felt less like a hospital and more like a vast cathedral of human suffering, a place where the outer edges of consciousness were laid bare for all to see. His very first days there confirmed what he had always suspected, that madness was not simply an illness, but a kind of language, a symbolic expression of inner conflict and forgotten truths. His mentor at the institution was Eugen Bleuler, a brilliant but eccentric psychiatrist whose name would soon become synonymous with schizophrenia, a term he himself coined. Bleuler believed in humane treatment, refusing to see his patients as lost causes. He encouraged dialogue, curiosity, and exploration, values that aligned perfectly with Jung's own instincts. Under Bleuler's guidance, Jung felt the excitement of being at the forefront of a new scientific era, but it was in his interactions with the patients themselves that Jung truly came alive. He spent hours listening to their fragmented stories, decoding their hallucinations, analysing their dreams. Unlike other doctors who dismissed their words as meaningless ramblings, Jung sensed structure, symbolism, and wounded truth beneath their chaos. He believed that the human psyche was not random, but meaningful, even in madness. One of his earliest and most famous patients was a young woman named Sabine Spielrein, whose case would alter the trajectory of Jung's life and leave an imprint on psychoanalysis itself. She arrived at Burg Hölzli in 1904, trembling, volatile, and tormented by uncontrollable fits. To other doctors, she seemed irredeemably hysterical, but Jung saw in her a depth of emotional intelligence and symbolic expression that fascinated him. He spent countless hours by her side, slowly coaxing out the memories and buried traumas that fueled her condition. As Sabina improved, their relationship grew complicated. She admired Jung's intellect with almost religious devotion, and Jung, struggling with his own unresolved emotional life, found himself drawn into a bond that blurred the lines between doctor and patient. Decades later, Their intense and controversial connection would become the subject of heated debates among historians and psychologists. But at the time, what mattered most to Jung was not the scandal that hindsight would uncover. It was the realization that the human mind possessed depths and contradictions far more intricate than conventional medicine acknowledged. Sabina's dreams, fantasies, and symbolic insights awakened something powerful in Jung. A conviction that the unconscious was not merely a hidden part of the mind, but a living reality, an entire world within. It was during these years that Jung began experimenting with what he would eventually call word association tests. He discovered that certain words triggered emotional reactions in patients, changes in breathing, heart rate, tone of voice, that revealed hidden complexes. These complexes, he believed, were the secret architects of psychological suffering, influencing behaviour from the shadows. It was the first empirical evidence that the unconscious was not a philosophical idea, but a measurable force. Word association tests made Jung famous in psychiatric circles. Invitations to lecture followed, along with scientific collaborations, publications, and growing recognition. Jung felt the thrill of being at the cutting edge of a science still in its infancy. He was convinced that psychology needed a revolution, a deeper understanding of how inner forces shaped outer behaviour. And it was through these experiments that Jung first encountered the man who would change his life more profoundly than anyone else, Sigmund Freud. Freud at this time was already a rising figure. His theories of repression, sexuality, and the unconscious were spreading slowly through Europe, though they were still considered scandalous by respectable society. Jung, intrigued, devoured Freud's writings late into the night. For the first time, he felt that another mind shared his fascination with the unseen forces beneath consciousness. When Jung sent him the results of his word association studies, Freud responded with enthusiasm. "At last," Freud wrote, "someone has understood me." Their correspondence grew intense, filled with long letters about dreams, symbolism, and the architecture of the psyche. Jung felt as though he had found an intellectual soulmate, someone who not only answered his questions, but asked even deeper ones. In 1907, Jung travelled to Vienna to meet Freud in person. They spoke for 13 straight hours, barely pausing to eat or rest. Freud later claimed he had never met anyone whose mind worked with such originality. Jung, in turn, felt an almost gravitational pull toward Freud, a father figure he had longed for since childhood. Freud, recognizing Jung's brilliance, soon declared him the future of psychoanalysis. He believed Jung could carry the movement beyond the narrow confines of Jewish intellectual circles into the wider scientific world. Jung, tall, charismatic, and Swiss Protestant, seemed the perfect ambassador. And for a time, Jung accepted this role. He admired Freud deeply, learning from him, collaborating with him, and helping shape psychoanalysis into a global movement. Yet even in those early days, something in Jung resisted. Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the root of all psychological conflict struck Jung as too narrow, too reductive. To Jung, the psyche was a vast mythological landscape, filled with symbols, archetypes, and spiritual questions that Freud dismissed as fantasies. And Freud, for all his brilliance, was rigidly protective of his theories. He demanded loyalty from his inner circle, fearing that disagreement would fracture the movement. Jung, who had spent his childhood wrestling with a father crushed by doubt and conformity, felt uneasy under Freud's authority. Yet he remained devoted to the friendship. For a few luminous years, their alliance was one of the most fruitful in the history of psychology. Patient cases were exchanged, theories debated, letters exchanged almost weekly. Together, they explored dreams, mythology, and the architecture of the unconscious. Meanwhile, Jung's own life changed dramatically. In 1903, he married Emma Rauschenbach, a young woman from a prominent Swiss family whose wealth provided Jung with financial security. Emma, intelligent and patient, supported his demanding career, managed his household, and raised their growing family. Though Jung would later struggle with fidelity, his relationship with Sabina never fully closed, and other emotional entanglements followed. Emma remained a steady, grounding presence throughout his life. By 1905, Jung had become the deputy director of Burghölzli, admired by staff and students alike. He lectured at the University of Zurich and wrote prolifically, producing works that blended clinical science with philosophical depth. His fame expanded, and so did his confidence. He felt on the cusp of something extraordinary, an insight into the psyche that would surpass even Freud's. Yet beneath the success, something darker stirred. Jung began experiencing dreams and visions that unsettled him. Images of ancient gods, great floods, and vast symbolic landscapes. His patient's dreams seemed to resonate with his own unconscious material, as though the boundary between doctor and patient were dissolving. He sensed that his psyche was preparing him for a confrontation, a journey he didn't yet understand. Near the end of the decade, Jung had a recurring dream that would become prophetic. He saw Europe covered by a great flood of blood. Buildings destroyed, civilizations collapsing under a tidal wave of violence. At the time, he interpreted the dream as symbolic of inner turmoil. Only years later, when the First World War erupted, did he realize its deeper meaning. The haunted child, who had grown into a doctor of haunted minds, was now standing at the threshold of the greatest psychological break and breakthrough of his entire life. Soon, he would be forced to choose between Freud's authority and his own inner truth, and that choice would plunge him into an abyss from which he would emerge transformed, carrying with him the foundations of what would become analytical psychology. Part 3. The Fracture with Freud, 1909-1914. When Carl Jung returned from America in 1909, after the famous trip in which he and Sigmund Freud had crossed the Atlantic together, lectured at Clark University, and been received with a respect neither had ever quite experienced before, he felt both exhilarated and uneasy. The American audiences had listened to Freud's and Jung's ideas as though they were revelations, as though these two European scholars had opened a hidden doorway into the human soul. The applause had been warm, the interest profound, the excitement genuine. Yet beneath that outward triumph, something inside Jung had shifted, something he could not yet name. The voyage back to Europe had been long, filled with evenings of conversation that grew heavier, slower, and more intense the further they travelled across the open sea. Freud spoke endlessly of repression, of sexuality, of the hidden desires that shaped human behaviour. Jung listened respectfully, taking in every word, admiring the vastness of Freud's intellect. Yet each time he suggested that perhaps the psyche contained realms beyond sexuality, spiritual dimensions, mythic structures, symbolic patterns that stretched back into prehistory. Freud would tighten, would close his expression like a door shutting in the night. He would insist that to leave the firm ground of sexual theory was to plunge into mysticism, into superstition, into danger. Freud had chosen Jung as his heir, had entrusted him with the future of psychoanalysis, but Jung felt increasingly constrained by this mantle. To Freud, the unconscious was a dark cellar filled with repressed wishes. To Jung, the unconscious was a cathedral, a vast, echoing structure filled with ancient symbols, powerful images, and the residue of countless human lives. Where Freud saw pathology, Jung saw meaning. Where Freud saw instinct, Jung saw myth. And where Freud saw a son, Jung felt the burden of being made into something he could not remain forever. By the time the ship reached Bremen, Jung knew that something fundamental had changed between them, even if neither man had spoken of it aloud. Back in Zurich, his work flourished. He continued to teach, analyse, write, and expand psychoanalysis across Europe. His home in Küsnacht became a gathering place for students, admirers, and young doctors eager to study under the man widely seen as Freud's most gifted disciple. Jung's lectures drew crowds. His clinical observations were admired. His charisma, confidence, and originality made him the bright star of the psychoanalytic movement. Yet the tension inside him grew, fed by dreams and visions he could not ignore. One of these dreams haunted him for years. In it, a great house stood before him, beautiful, elaborate, and filled with elegant furniture. He wandered through its rooms, admiring their refinement, feeling at home within its walls. But when he descended to the cellar, he found a set of steps leading even deeper downward to an ancient stone chamber beneath the house. There were bones there, remnants of prehistoric life, fragment of a world far older than his conscious mind. He sensed that this hidden basement represented the collective unconscious, something deeper and older than personal experience, a realm Freud refused to acknowledge. Jung shared the dream with Freud, hoping for dialogue, but Freud became uneasy, almost fearful. Symbols made him uncomfortable. Spiritual themes made him defensive. Jung's dreams, filled with ancient imagery and mythic structure, seemed to Freud like a betrayal of scientific rigour. And each time Jung tried to explore these deeper layers of the psyche, Freud would gently, and then, not so gently, steer him back towards sexuality. The more Freud insisted, the more Jung felt the inner divide widen. Personality number 2, the old, wise presence from his childhood, began to whisper again, urging him to explore what others feared. His dreams grew stronger, richer, more vivid. He saw great rivers of blood sweeping across Europe. He saw fire consuming cities. He saw waves crashing against the shores of consciousness, overwhelming the rational order of Western thought. At the time, he believed these were personal visions. Only later would he realize that his psyche had been sounding an alarm about the catastrophe soon to engulf the continent. In 1910, Freud pressed Jung to become the president of the newly formed International Psychoanalytic Association. Jung accepted the position, hoping perhaps that he could bridge their differences, that he could guide psychoanalysis gently into more expansive territory. But with each passing year, the pressure mounted. Freud treated him with affection, but also with suspicion. Letters became laced with subtle warnings. Discussions grew tense. Freud feared that Jung's growing interest in mythology, religion, and symbolism would corrupt the movement before it had solidified its scientific reputation. "Promise me you will never abandon the sexual theory," Freud urged. It was a moment that chilled Jung to his core. It was as though Freud were insisting not merely on loyalty, but on a kind of faith, a creed that demanded obedience. Jung could not give that promise. His entire life had been shaped by the refusal to accept easy answers, to cling to doctrines out of fear. He had watched his father's faith collapse under the weight of unexamined dogma. He would not, could not, allow himself to be bound to Freud's dogma in the same way. The break began slowly, almost imperceptibly, with debates in letters, subtle disagreements in lectures, and quiet shifts in theoretical emphasis. But soon it grew undeniable. Jung published work that Freud saw as dangerously mystical. Freud criticized Jung in private, lamenting that his chosen successor had been seduced by irrationality. Their relationship darkened, thickened, strained under the weight of disappointment. In 1912, Jung delivered the blow Freud could not forgive, his book Symbols of Transformation. It was a sweeping exploration of myth, religion, dreams, libido, and the evolution of consciousness. It argued that psychic energy was not merely sexual but symbolic, creative, spiritual, a force that moved through humanity as a whole, not just through individuals. It was brilliant, daring, and utterly incompatible with Freud's vision. Freud read it with growing horror. He felt betrayed. Jung, for his part, felt liberated and terrified. Their final break occurred not in person but in letters. Letters that began warmly and ended sharply, painfully, almost coldly. Freud accused Jung of abandoning science. Jung accused Freud of clinging to dogma. Freud ended the correspondence with a short, devastating note declaring their relationship finished. And just like that, the most important intellectual friendship of Jung's life collapsed. But the emotional toll was far greater than Jung had expected. Freud had been a father figure, a mentor, a companion through the uncharted depths of the mind. Losing him was like losing a part of himself. Jung felt unmoored, adrift, hollowed out. He tried to continue his academic work, his clinical practice, his lectures. But something had ruptured inside him. Then came the dreams. Dreams of darkness. Dreams of ancient gods rising from deep water. Dreams of Europe drowning in blood. Jung believed at first that he was losing his mind. He felt a great storm rising within him, a flood of unconscious material bursting through the fragile walls of his consciousness. He described it later as a psycho-spiritual earthquake, as though his psyche had been shattered open to reveal an abyss beneath. This period, what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, was one of the most terrifying and fertile chapters of his life. He would spend hours alone in his study, drawing, writing, entering into waking visions that bordered on psychosis. He feared that he might be consumed by the very forces he had spent his career studying, but he persisted, guided by something ancient within him, something that told him this descent was necessary. In this darkness, he created the foundation of his life's work. He discovered archetypes, universal patterns of thought and imagery that appear in dreams, myths, and visions across all of human history. He understood at last that the unconscious was not just personal, but collective, a vast reservoir of ancestral memory. He saw that the psyche was a self-regulating system, always moving toward wholeness, toward what he would call individuation. Most importantly, he discovered the shadow, the dark, denied aspects of the self that each of us carries within. It was not an enemy, but a guide, a mirror, revealing the parts of ourselves we fear to acknowledge. To reject the shadow was to reject half of one's soul. To face it was to begin the journey toward genuine self-knowledge. The break with Freud had shattered his outer world, but it opened the entrance to his inner one. And as the Great War loomed on the horizon, Jung would find that the darkness inside him was only a reflection of the darkness about to engulf the world. Part 4. The Descent into the Red Book, 1914-1920. When the first tremors of war rattled across Europe in the summer of 1914, Carl Jung felt something inside him shift with an eerie sense of recognition. For years his dreams had been filled with visions of floodwaters swallowing cities, of fire sweeping across the continent, of ancient gods rising from the depths in a primal storm. Now, as armies mobilized, as borders crackled with tension, as the world edged closer to catastrophe, Jung realized that the visions that had once terrified him were not just personal omens. They were premonitions of a collective eruption, the unconscious of Europe bursting into violent reality. The outbreak of the First World War marked the beginning of the darkest, most inward-turning chapter of Jung's life. While nations declared loyalty to flags and empires, Jung declared loyalty to something else entirely, the truth buried deep within his own psyche. And so began the descent that would define him, his journey into the inner world that he chronicled in the pages of what would eventually become known as the Red Book. The war isolated him. Former colleagues drifted away, letters grew cold, invitations ceased. Freud's circle denounced him openly, calling him a mystic, a heretic, a man who had lost his way. Jung resigned from the International Psychoanalytic Association, cut off from the movement he had once helped lead. The rupture was complete, and yet he felt strangely unburdened. He no longer owed loyalty to theories he did not believe. No longer did he need to pretend that the psyche was a mere battleground of sexual drives. He was free, terrifyingly free, to explore what lay beneath the surface of consciousness. He built a small retreat tower on the shores of Lake Zurich, a modest stone structure without electricity or modern comforts. It was a place removed from the noise of the world, a place where the winds from the lake whispered through the windows, and the night stretched long and silent. In this loneliness, Jung surrendered to the visions that had been haunting him with increasing intensity. He welcomed them, he invited them, he allowed them to speak, and they did. What Jung experienced during these years cannot be summarized easily, for it was not just a psychological experiment, but a confrontation with the deepest layers of human symbolism. He would sit at his desk for hours, entering a state halfway between dreaming and waking, a kind of deliberate descent into the unconscious. Images surged through him, a red sea of blood rising. From the earth, a towering figure of a bearded prophet, serpents coiling around his feet, a massive tree with golden leaves growing from a wound in his side. He met figures who spoke to him in riddles, old men, wise women, warriors, magicians, devils, children, and gods. Each one seemed to hold a fragment of truth, a part of himself he had long ignored or rejected. He wrote everything down in black notebooks first, raw, unfiltered accounts of the visions, the dialogues, the overwhelming flood of images that poured forth. Then, painstakingly, he transcribed them into a large, red, leather-bound volume, writing in an ornate calligraphic script and illuminating the pages with intricate paintings. It was the work of a medieval monk, the work of a mystic chronicling his encounter with eternity. He called the process active imagination, and through it he discovered not only the shadow but the self, the inner totality of the psyche, the guiding centre toward which the individual must travel. But this journey was not peaceful. It tore him apart. He feared madness constantly. There were nights when he felt the visions would swallow him whole, when the boundary between his consciousness and the archetypal realm dissolved completely. He would sit at his desk with trembling hands, unsure whether he was exploring a psychological landscape or slipping irreversibly into psychosis. And yet, even in his deepest fear, a voice inside him whispered that this descent was necessary. He sensed that humanity too was undergoing a collective descent, the war being a vast projection of the shadow that Europe had refused to acknowledge. The nations believed they were fighting for honour, for power, for patriotism. Jung believed they were fighting themselves. During this period, Jung found solace in carving stone. He gathered blocks from the lakeshore and chiselled them into figures, faces, and symbols that matched the images rising from his unconscious. It grounded him, gave form to what felt formless. Each sculpture was an encounter, a dialogue, a way of anchoring the mythic realm in physical reality. His hands became the translators of his dreams. The war dragged on. Jung's visions deepened. One night he dreamed of a great serpent winding around a scarlet sun. Another night he saw a figure resembling Elijah, the prophet, guiding him through a desert landscape. A young woman, Salome, blind yet radiant, appeared beside Elijah, her blindness symbolizing inner sight, her presence unsettling and enigmatic. These figures returned repeatedly, teaching him, confronting him, revealing truths he had not asked for. He came to understand that the human mind was not a single, unified entity, but a vast constellation of forces, some personal, others impersonal, some ancient, others newly formed, some benevolent, others dangerous. Each archetype carried a lesson, each symbol carried weight. He began to see humanity differently, not as a species driven solely by reason, but as a species driven by myth, dream, and instinct. The war, he realised, was a mythic catastrophe playing out on a global stage. Entire nations had been possessed by collective archetypes, war gods demanding sacrifice, shadows seeking blood. The individual psyche mirrored the collective psyche, and the collective psyche mirrored the individual. As he recorded these insights, Jung felt them crystallize into a new framework of understanding. He saw that psychological growth required confrontation with the unconscious, that individuation, the journey towards wholeness, demanded that a person face the shadow, listen to the anima or animus, and strive toward the self. He understood that symbols were not mere decorations of the mind, but the language of the soul. He realized that humanity's spiritual crises were psychological crises, and that healing would require more than science. It would require meaning. By 1916, the worst of the visions had subsided, though they continued to flicker at the edges of his awareness. The intensity of the early descent slowly gave way to integration. Jung was no longer merely being overwhelmed by images. He was working with them, dialoguing with them, shaping them into theory and understanding. The inner chaos began to form a structure. The darkness found a container. And in doing so, Jung found himself. But the world outside remained in turmoil. The war shattered millions of lives, toppled empires, and left Europe traumatized. In the aftermath, Jung believed he had uncovered something essential, that the breakdown of civilization was a reflection of a deeper psychological breakdown, a failure to confront the shadow, a refusal to acknowledge the instincts and symbols that lived beneath rational society. The years immediately after the war were quieter. Jung returned gradually to teaching and clinical work. Students sought him out again, drawn by the depth and originality of his insights. But Jung was different now, more grounded, more certain, more whole. He had descended into the abyss and returned, carrying the treasure of understanding that only such a descent could provide. The Red Book was completed in its illuminated form by 1922, though Jung would continue to add material to his private journals for decades. Yet he refused to publish it. The world, he believed, was not ready. The contents were too raw, too personal, too easily misunderstood. It was a map of the inner world, meant not for academic criticism, but for the soul's journey. Even Emma, his wife, watched these years with concern and awe. She had stood by him, raising their children, managing their home, holding the practical world together while Carl ventured into inner realms beyond her comprehension. Though their marriage had endured complexities and infidelities, Emma's loyalty never wavered. She understood something few others could, that Carl's descent was not madness, but transformation. By the time Europe began to rebuild itself, Jung was emerging from his long night with a new vision of psychology, one rooted not in pathology, but in the quest for meaning, wholeness, and connection with the deepest layers of the human spirit. He had faced the shadow within himself. Now he would teach the world to do the same. Part 5. The Architect of Archetypes. 1920-1930. When the storm of Jung's inner descent finally began to calm in the early 1920s, he emerged from those years of visions and solitude like a man who had walked through fire. Something in him had settled. Something in him had transformed. His eyes still held that familiar intensity, but now there was a new steadiness behind them, a groundedness that had not been present before. He had confronted the abyss within himself, and instead of destroying him, it had illuminated truths that would shape the rest of his life. The Europe Jung returned to was wounded, exhausted, and searching for meaning. The Great War had shattered empires, fractured families, and left entire nations haunted by grief and uncertainty. People who once trusted in rational progress and scientific certainty now found themselves adrift. The old gods were gone. The new world felt hollow. And in this cultural vacuum, Jung sensed a collective need that mirrored the personal needs of his patients. A hunger for symbols, for myth, for something deeper than logic to hold the fractured mind together. Jung believed that society's wounds were psychological wounds, that the crisis of the modern world was, at its heart, a crisis of the soul. He saw around him a civilization that had severed itself from its spiritual roots, that tried to heal war trauma with technology, economics, and politics, but ignored the psychic foundations beneath. The invisible world, the world of dreams, symbols, fears, desires, had erupted violently in the trenches of World War I, and Jung feared it would erupt again if not understood. It was during this period that Jung began to shape the theories that would define analytical psychology. His descent had taught him that the human mind was not merely personal but collective, not merely shaped by childhood, but by millennia of human experience. The images he encountered in his visions were not unique to him. They were symbols that appeared across cultures and centuries. He recognized gods from the ancient world, motifs from medieval alchemy, themes from Eastern religions, and even patterns present in tribal myths from Africa and the Americas. If these images lived in him, Jung reasoned, they must live in all of us. And so he named this deeper layer of the psyche the collective unconscious, the shared inheritance of humanity, a universal reservoir of symbolic forms he called archetypes. The archetypes were not literal figures, but patterns, structures of psychic energy that shaped how humans experienced the world. The mother, the father, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the child. These were not merely characters from stories, but expressions of fundamental psychological forces. But Jung was not content to simply name these archetypes. He wanted to understand how they influenced human life, how they emerged in dreams, how they guided behaviour, how they shaped cultures. He saw them in ancient myths, in the rituals of indigenous tribes, in religious ceremonies, in fairy tales, in art, in hallucinations, and even in modern political movements. Everywhere he looked, he found the same symbolic patterns repeating themselves like echoes from the depths of time. To explore these patterns, Jung travelled widely throughout the 1920s. He visited North Africa, wandering through the bright, sun-washed streets of Tunis and Algiers, speaking with local spiritual practitioners, marvelling at the intensity of Islamic symbolism. He journeyed to the American Southwest, where he lived among the Pueblo people, observing their rituals and listening as elders spoke about their spiritual connection to the land and the cosmos. He was deeply moved by the Pueblo perspective that the sun was a living god, an idea that resonated with the symbolic imagery that had emerged from his own unconscious. He realized that what Westerners called primitive was often closer to the psychic roots of humanity than industrial societies were. These travels convinced him that modern Europeans were spiritually starved. They had abandoned myth and ritual, relying solely on reason and technology, severing themselves from the symbolic nourishment that had sustained human consciousness for thousands of years. Jung saw this spiritual hunger as a dangerous void, one that could easily be filled by destructive ideologies. And he feared that another eruption of the collective shadow could sweep across Europe if people continued to deny the depths within themselves. At home in Switzerland, Jung began teaching again, drawing groups of students who were captivated by the depth and originality of his thought. His lectures were not lectures in the traditional sense, they were journeys. He would speak for hours, weaving together mythology, dreams, anthropology, religion, alchemy, and psychology with such fluidity that listeners often felt they were travelling across centuries and continents without leaving the room. Students described feeling as if Jung were tapping into an ancient spring of knowledge, revealing the symbolic architecture of the world. His home in Küsnacht became a quiet centre of pilgrimage. Artists, psychoanalysts, philosophers, writers, and spiritual seekers travelled from across the globe to hear him speak, to show him their dreams, to ask him about their visions. Many of them were surprised by his simple manner. He did not dress like a prophet or mystic, and he did not speak with the grandiosity of a philosopher. He was warm, humble, often humorous, sometimes blunt, and always deeply present. He listened with an intensity that few had ever experienced. When he analysed a dream, it was as if he entered it himself, walking through its symbolic landscape as naturally as he walked along the shores of Lake Zurich. Despite this growing influence, Jung remained somewhat apart from academic psychology. His ideas were too vast, too symbolic, too spiritual for the universities. And Jung was fine with that. He felt that institutional psychology was still too narrow, too obsessed with measurement and categorization, too afraid to acknowledge the mysteries of the soul. He preferred the freedom to explore the psyche without constraints, even if it meant being labelled a heretic by mainstream science. During these years, Jung also deepened his understanding of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. He saw these inner figures as bridges between consciousness and the unconscious, mediators between the ego and the deeper layers of the psyche. Dreams featuring mysterious women or shadowy male figures held special significance, revealing the inner balance or imbalance of the individual. These concepts would eventually influence not only psychology, but also literature, film, and art throughout the 20th century. Yet while his theoretical work expanded, Jung's personal life remained complex. His marriage to Emma continued, stable yet demanding. Emma was not only his wife, but also his collaborator, managing their household while Jung travelled, lectured, and immersed himself in symbolic study. She bore the weight of raising their 5 children and endured the emotional challenges created by Jung's relationships with other women, including Toni Wolff, a brilliant young analyst who became Jung's student, confidant, intellectual partner, and in many ways his muse. Their relationship was unconventional and painful for all involved, yet it shaped Jung's intellectual development deeply. Wolff offered insights that sharpened his understanding of feminine psychology and symbolic structure. Emma, with great strength and dignity, maintained the stability of the Jung household. Jung himself struggled throughout these years to balance his love for both women, his responsibilities as a husband and father, and his insatiable hunger for inner and outer exploration. Professionally, these years were fertile beyond measure. Jung wrote extensively, producing works that remain foundational to psychology, psychological types being the most influential among them. Published in 1921, this book laid out his now famous theory of personality typology, introducing concepts like introversion and extroversion, as well as the 4 psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. These ideas would eventually inspire the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a tool used today around the world to understand personality differences. But the heart of Jung's work during this decade was not found in books or lectures. It was found in the inner world he continued to explore, the symbolic landscapes he continued to map. The Red Book, though never published during his lifetime, served as a constant reminder of the raw, powerful source from which his ideas emerged. He kept it hidden but close, a private scripture that guided his understanding of the psyche. As the 1920s came to a close, Jung felt both fulfilled and restless. He had built a new psychological system from the ground up, one that integrated science, spirituality, myth, and symbol. He was respected, sought after, admired by many. Yet he sensed that civilization was once again drifting toward danger. The collective shadow was growing restless. Europe's political tensions were simmering. Something in the air felt familiar, reminiscent of the dark, foreboding dreams that had preceded the Great War. He knew the psyche well enough to recognize the symptoms. When a society loses its connection to meaning, it turns toward extremes. When individuals refuse to confront their own shadow, that shadow does not disappear. It is projected outwards, onto neighbours, onto minority groups, onto political enemies, onto entire nations. Jung feared that Europe was about to project its shadow on a catastrophic scale, and soon the world would learn that he was right. Part 6. The Shadow over Europe, 1930-1939. As the 1930s unfolded, the mood across Europe began to darken in ways that felt painfully familiar to Carl Jung. He had spent decades studying the collective unconscious, watching archetypes rise and fall like ancient tides shaping the fate of civilizations. And now he sensed, almost before political analysts or historians could articulate it, that something primal and dangerous was awakening. The air felt charged. People spoke with new bitterness and fear. Nations turned inward, clinging to symbols of strength, purity, and destiny. It was, Jung realized, the unmistakable stirring of the shadow. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany was, for Jung, not merely a political event, but a psychological earthquake. To others, Hitler was a ruthless demagogue. To Jung, he was a man possessed by archetypes, an embodiment of ancient forces that had erupted from the depths of the collective psyche. He saw in Hitler's speeches the unmistakable cadence of myth. He saw in the rallies the hypnotic pull of ritual. He saw in the German nation the same patterns he observed in individuals who projected their own darkness onto others, creating enemies where none existed. Jung began to warn his students. When a society refuses to confront its own darkness, that darkness chooses a human face and leads the masses wherever it wishes. His lectures from this period took on a gravity that startled even those who had followed him for years. He spoke of Wotan, the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy, awakening after centuries of slumber. He spoke of the inflation of the national ego, a psychological condition that created the illusion of purity and righteousness while hiding the rot beneath. He spoke of the terrifying ease with which entire nations could fall into a collective state of possession, driven not by reason, but by archetypal forces older than history itself. Students who attended his talks in Germany noticed the unease in the room. Some nodded solemnly, recognizing the truth behind his words. Others shifted nervously, aware of the political dangers surrounding such interpretations. Jung himself felt a strange mixture of clarity and dread. His own descent into the unconscious during the war years had given him insight into the human mind's capacity for destruction. But now he saw those inner forces spilling outward, sweeping across borders and infecting millions. Privately, Jung agonized over the moral implications of his insights. He knew that psychoanalysis alone could not stop the march of authoritarianism, but he believed deeply that only a psychological awakening, a confrontation with the shadow, could prevent disaster. And he feared that Europe was far from such awakening. At home in Switzerland, Jung continued his clinical practice. Patients arrived with dreams more vivid and disturbing than before. Dreams of fires sweeping across forests, of cities collapsing, of monstrous figures looming over their beds. Jung saw these not as individual nightmares, but as reflections of the collective psyche. The unconscious, he believed, always speaks before history does. His work with patients became more intense. He guided them gently toward understanding their inner conflicts, their repressed desires, their hidden fears. He emphasized the importance of confronting the shadow, not suppressing it, not denying it, but acknowledging it as part of the self. But he also knew that most people were terrified of their own darkness. It was easier, far easier, to project it outward onto scapegoats, enemies, and political figures. Meanwhile, Jung's professional reputation remained embroiled in controversy. Critics accused him of dabbling in mysticism. Freud loyalists denounced him as a traitor, whose ideas had descended into spiritualism. Though Jung lived quietly, he could not escape the storms that surrounded him. Some Nazi officials misinterpreted his ideas about archetypes and race, twisting them into something he found abhorrent. Jung rejected these distortions, speaking cautiously yet firmly against them, but misinformation spread quickly in those volatile years. The truth was more complex than headlines or rumours could capture. Jung's understanding of cultural psychology, his belief that different societies carried different psychological patterns, was not rooted in superiority or discrimination, but in historical and symbolic analysis. Yet, in a world teetering toward extremist ideology, nuance was easily lost. Jung found himself walking a razor-thin line, misunderstood by many, admired by some, and feared by others. Despite this turmoil, his personal life continued with a quiet rhythm. Emma, always a steady presence, anchored the home with patience and grace. Jung's children were grown by now, carving their own paths through a Europe full of uncertainty. His relationship with Toni Wolff deepened intellectually, though it remained complicated emotionally. The triangle between Jung, Emma, and Toni had become an unconventional but strangely stable arrangement, a reflection of Jung's capacity to live within complexities that most people avoided. During these years, Jung spent more time at his tower in Bollingen, the stone retreat he had begun building more than a decade earlier. The tower had grown with him, expanding from a simple structure into a symbolic refuge, a place where he could think, write, and reconnect with the inner world. Its circular walls, carved stones, and hand-painted symbols reflected the archetypal landscapes he had explored in the Red Book. Here, surrounded by water, wind, and silence, he found a peace that the outer world lacked. He often sat on the lakeshore at dusk, watching the sun sink below the mountains, the sky turning shades of violet and gold. In those moments, he felt the presence of the self, quiet, eternal, stable. He felt the pulse of ancient symbols stirring in the twilight. He felt, above all, that despite the chaos of the world, the psyche remained a source of deep wisdom, waiting patiently for humanity to listen. Yet even in these tranquil moments, Jung's dreams continued to echo with warnings. One dream in particular troubled him deeply. He saw a river of blood flowing through Europe once again, more violent and more devastating than before. He woke with the same sense of dread he had felt years earlier, before the outbreak of the First World War. He knew the signs. He had seen them before. The shadow was rising once more. By 1936, the political situation had deteriorated beyond anything Europe had experienced since the Great War. Propaganda intensified. Freedoms eroded. Hostility grew. Jung wrote letters to colleagues urging them to examine the psychological roots of extremism, but few wanted to listen. Academics were cautious. Analysts were divided. Ordinary people were frightened. The collective shadow demanded obedience, and millions complied. One evening in 1937, Jung sat at his Bollingen tower with a candle burning beside him, the pages of his journal open. He wrote slowly, deliberately, reflecting on the darkness enveloping the continent. He believed that humanity stood at a crossroads, not between nations, but between states of consciousness. When an inner situation is not made conscious, he wrote, it appears outside as fate. He had seen this truth in individuals countless times. A man who denies his anger erupts in violence. A woman who ignores her grief becomes consumed by depression. A person who avoids conflict discovers conflict at every turn. And now he saw the same pattern in Europe. The nations that had refused to confront the wounds of the last war were stumbling blindly toward another. Jung spent the final years of the 1930s preparing himself inwardly. He did not know what the coming years would demand of him, but he sensed that his role as a psychological interpreter of collective events would be more important than ever. He looked at the world with clear eyes, refusing comforting illusions. He hoped that perhaps, in some small way, his teachings about individuation, the shadow, and the archetypes might help guide others through the darkness. Yet even he could not foresee the scale of the devastation that was about to unfold. When 1939 arrived, the air felt heavy, thick with inevitability. Peace talks failed. Threats escalated. And then, like a great wave crashing upon a fragile shore, war descended once more. For Jung, the storm he had sensed for years had finally arrived, not only to test Europe, but to test everything he had learned about the human soul. Chapter 7. The War Within and Without, 1939-1945. When the Second World War broke over Europe in 1939, Jung felt a familiar tremor ripple through the collective psyche, an echo of the inner storms he had faced decades earlier during his own descent into the unconscious. To most of the world, the war was a geopolitical catastrophe, a conflict of armies and leaders and nations. But to Jung, it was something deeper and darker. He recognized in its violence the unmistakable eruption of archetypal forces that had been gathering for years beneath the veneer of civilization. The shadow, long ignored and denied, had risen again. From his quiet home in Küsnacht, Jung watched the early years of the war unfold with a sense of dread tempered by clarity. Switzerland remained officially neutral, yet no one inside its borders truly felt safe. The country was surrounded by nations swallowed or threatened by the Nazi regime, and rumours drifted across the mountains like cold winds, rumours of invasions, disappearances, persecution, and the steady expansion of terror. Jung listened to the radio with silent intensity. Each new announcement, each shift in the front lines, felt to him like a psychic symbol as much as a political event. During these years, Jung continued his clinical work, though his patients carried heavier burdens now. Their dreams, once personal, intimate, shaped by childhood wounds or private conflicts, grew filled with images of fire, destruction, and fractured societies. Jung noticed patterns repeating across patients from different nations, professions, and backgrounds. The dreams seemed synchronized, as though the unconscious of humanity were ringing like a struck bell. Archetypes were moving. The anima and animus appeared in distorted, wounded forms. The wise old man appeared broken, silenced, drowned beneath chaos. And the shadow, once a personal figure lurking at the edge of dreams, now erupted as monstrous dragons, warlords, and raging storms. Jung believed deeply that these dreams reflected the collective psyche's reaction to the war. The monsters were not fantasies, they were symbols of the destructive forces sweeping across Europe. The helpless figures represented the paralysis of nations. The broken archetypes represented the collapse of shared meaning. And through all this, Jung tried to guide each patient toward understanding, toward integration, toward some semblance of inner peace, even as the outer world fractured. His own dreams during the war were equally profound. He saw vast dark rivers running red through the Alps. He saw a massive black shape spreading over Europe like an eclipse. He saw symbols from ancient myths, Wotan descending with fury, Shiva dancing destruction, Moloch demanding sacrifice. These were not prophetic visions, but psychological ones, reflections of the collective psychic devastation unfolding around him. During this time, Jung wrote quietly but steadily, filling notebooks with thoughts, reflections, and interpretations of the war. He believed the conflict represented more than nationalism or political ideology. It was, in his eyes, a confrontation between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the fragile structures of modern rationality and the ancient forces that still live beneath them. One evening in 1940, as German forces surged across Western Europe with alarming speed, Jung sat by the window of his study, looking out at Lake Zurich glowing under the moon. The world felt eerily quiet, as though holding its breath. Jung sensed the psychological meaning of Hitler's power, not merely political propaganda, but the possession of a nation by a psychic archetype. He described Hitler as a medicine man, a man who embodied the collective unconscious of the German people, channeling energies older than Christianity, older than the Roman Empire, older even than recorded history. He felt chilled by the realization that millions had surrendered their personal consciousness to a mythic force. To Jung, the danger lay not only in Hitler's ideology, but in the psychic mechanism behind it: projection. A nation that refuses to face its own shadow will find a scapegoat, an enemy onto whom all its unwanted qualities can be cast. Jung saw this clearly. He feared it deeply, and he understood it personally, having confronted his own shadow years earlier during his Red Book period. Europe, however, had not confronted its shadow, and so it manifested on a monstrous scale. Despite the danger, Jung was not entirely isolated. Over the course of the war, he became secretly involved with British intelligence through the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. Individuals such as Alan Dulles sought Jung's insights to better understand Nazi psychology. Jung never acted as a political agent. He did not spy, did not gather intelligence, but he provided psychological interpretations of Hitler, his subordinates, and the German people as a whole. He believed that understanding the archetypes at play could help predict the regime's moves and eventual downfall. In Switzerland, Jung often met privately with refugees who arrived traumatized, displaced, their families torn apart. He listened to their stories with deep compassion, feeling the heaviness of their suffering settle deep into his bones. He worked with analysts and students still able to travel, guiding them through the psychological turmoil that mirrored global events. Some travelled across war-torn borders just to sit with him for an hour, seeking clarity on dreams that seemed too horrific to interpret. Jung met each with patience, understanding that in times of crisis, dream symbols become darker but also more urgent. By 1943, the war had entered a brutal new phase. News of concentration camps began to leak out, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with horror. Jung felt sickened as he realised the scale of the shadow's manifestation. It was beyond even his earlier fears. The archetype of the devouring mother had awakened, not in a single mind, but in a national ideology, consuming children, identities, entire communities. Humanity's most ancient fears were unfolding in real time, and Jung understood with heartbreaking clarity that no psychological theory could fully encompass such suffering. Yet even in these darkest moments, Jung held on to a fragile thread of hope. He believed that consciousness always seeks balance, and that even the most terrible eruptions of the shadow were part of an evolutionary movement. The psyche, he argued, would eventually demand integration, not endless destruction. But he also knew that the price for such collective awakening would be immense. Throughout the war, Jung spent increasing time at Bollingen, his stone tower sanctuary. The tower became a refuge not only for his thoughts but for his spirit. There, he carved new stones, each one etched with symbols reflecting his understanding of the war. He carved figures from mythology, heroes facing dragons, wounded kings seeking healing, serpents coiled in painful rebirth. He painted mandalas representing the self, centered and whole, surrounded by the storms of the unconscious. These works were not art in the traditional sense. They were conversations with the psyche, attempts to hold the world's chaos in symbolic form so it would not overwhelm him. During this time, he also deepened his understanding of alchemy, studying ancient texts that mirrored the transformation processes he saw in individuals and societies. The alchemists spoke of nigredo, the blackening, a phase of destruction, chaos, and decomposition necessary before rebirth. Jung recognized Europe as living through a vast nigredo, a descent into darkness that, if survived, might give rise to a new form of consciousness. But survival was not guaranteed. When D-Day arrived in 1944, Jung sensed a turning in the tide. The dreams of his patients shifted. The monstrous figures began to recede slightly. Symbols of hope appeared. Small lights, narrow paths, fragile children emerging from ruins. Jung believed these inner shifts reflected outer realities that the collective psyche knew when the war's momentum had changed. At last, in 1945, the war came to its long-awaited end. Europe lay devastated, cities in rubble, families shattered, generations traumatized. Jung watched with a mixture of sorrow and solemn acceptance. He knew that the external destruction mirrored the internal destruction that had occurred within the European psyche. The shadow had erupted with full force, and the price had been unimaginable. Yet now came the hardest part: integration. After the war, Jung often remarked that the true danger lay not in what had happened, but in what humanity would choose to forget. Shadows denied always return. The lessons ignored always resurface. He wrote and lectured tirelessly, urging people to reflect not only on the political causes of the war, but on the psychological ones. The projections, the denial of inner darkness, the collapse of mythical meaning, the inflation of collective ego. He believed the world stood at a new crossroads. Humanity had seen its own shadow exposed. Now it needed to decide whether to confront it or bury it again. In the quiet years immediately after the war, Jung noticed a new kind of dream emerging among his patients. Dreams filled with rebuilding, with light returning after darkness, with images of circles and mandalas symbolizing wholeness. The psyche was beginning to heal. Jung, too, began to heal. He had survived the chaos of his inner world decades earlier. Now he had survived the chaos of the outer world. And as he looked toward the next chapter of his life, he felt that his true work, helping humanity understand its own depths, was only just beginning. Part 8. The Healing Light of the Self, 1945-1955. When the war finally ended in 1945, Carl Jung felt as though a great weight had been lifted from the collective soul of humanity, even if the world lay in ruins. Europe, stunned and hollow-eyed, emerged blinking into the fragile daylight of peace, scarred by memories too terrible to speak aloud. Cities lay in ashes. Families wandered through the remains of their former lives, searching for missing loved ones. Nations began the long and painful work of reckoning with what had happened, though many preferred forgetfulness over introspection. Jung watched this process with a mixture of sorrow and determined clarity. He knew instinctively that what had been destroyed outwardly was only a reflection of what had been damaged inwardly. And now, the deeper work had to begin, the work of healing. For Jung, the early post-war years felt strangely familiar, as though history were echoing the psychological cycles he had long observed in individuals. A collapse of order had been followed by chaos. Chaos now sought meaning. Meaning would eventually seek integration. Just as the psyche required confrontation with its shadow, the world now had to confront the monstrous reality of what it had done. But Jung also knew that the human mind prefers to bury what it cannot bear to face. And so he felt a renewed responsibility to speak, to write, and to teach. His own health, shaken during the war years, began to falter. In 1944, he had suffered a severe heart attack, leaving him perilously close to death. During that near-death experience, Jung entered a visionary state unlike anything he had known, even during his Red Book period. He described floating high above the earth, seeing the planet turn slowly in golden light, feeling an overwhelming peace that washed through him like a cosmic tide. He sensed that he was leaving life, that he was approaching a realm beyond time. There was no fear, only a profound stillness, a feeling of homecoming. But then he felt a pull, soft yet insistent, drawing him back into his body. A nurse entered his room, checking his pulse, adjusting his blankets, touching his hand to ensure he was warm. To Jung, that small gesture of human care felt like an anchor thrown from the physical world. He returned reluctantly, carrying with him not disappointment, but insight. He wrote later that he felt as if he had been shown a glimpse of eternity, of the self in its purest form, a wholeness beyond earthly suffering. The experience deepened his sense of purpose. He believed more strongly than ever that human life was a journey toward integration, toward understanding the totality of one's being. But he also recognized that the trauma of the war had fractured the psyches of millions, leaving people spiritually numb, unable to make meaning of their experiences. Jung saw that much of the post-war world lacked a connection to the symbolic dimension of life. Traditional religion had been weakened or hollowed out by its failure to prevent war. Rational philosophy could not explain the scale of human cruelty. Political ideologies had shown their catastrophic potential. And so, in the vacuum left behind, Jung believed that psychology, depth psychology, needed to become the new language of meaning. In the late 1940s, Jung devoted himself to writing with renewed energy. His works from this period are among his most profound, shaped by the urgency of a world seeking order after chaos. He wrote about the archetypes of the unconscious, detailing their manifestations in dreams, myths, and religious symbols. He elaborated on individuation, the lifelong process of becoming one's authentic self. He explored alchemy, revealing how its medieval metaphors mirrored the psychological transformations of the modern soul. To many readers, these writings felt like lifelines thrown into a sea of uncertainty. Jung's words carried a sense of depth and mystery that resonated deeply with those who felt disconnected from traditional sources of wisdom. His ideas travelled far beyond Europe, influencing scholars, artists, theologians, and writers around the world. He became a figure of fascination, seen by some as a modern sage. Yet Jung himself remained humble about his reputation. He did not see himself as a prophet or guru. He saw himself as a doctor, a researcher, a man who had explored the depths of his own unconscious and now offered a map to others. He continued to see patients in Zurich, helping them navigate their dreams and inner conflicts with the same gentle, attentive presence he had brought to his work for decades. But Jung also sensed that humanity's psychological wounds extended far beyond individual therapy. He saw societies rebuilding their economies, reconstructing their cities, and reorganizing their governments, but neglecting the healing of the psyche. He warned that a wounded collective unconscious could easily give rise to new forms of extremism. The shadow, he knew, never disappears. It waits. And if ignored, it returns in new guises. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Jung's attention increasingly turned to the vast spiritual traditions of the East. He saw in Hinduism and Buddhism an understanding of the psyche that mirrored his own insights about the self. He studied the I Ching, fascinated by the ancient Chinese belief that the universe was structured by meaningful patterns rather than mechanical causality. He exchanged letters with scholars who specialized in Eastern philosophy, always careful to avoid romanticizing what he did not fully understand. Jung sought synthesis, not appropriation. One of his most influential collaborations during this time was with the German-Swiss scholar Richard Wilhelm, who had translated the I Ching into German. Wilhelm and Jung shared long conversations at Küsnacht, discussing synchronicity, the mysterious principle of meaningful coincidence. Wilhelm believed that the universe was alive with patterns waiting to be interpreted. Jung believed the same, and together they shaped the concept into one of Jung's most enigmatic and fascinating theories. Jung began to see synchronicity not as superstition, but as a fundamental principle connecting inner and outer events. He observed that meaningful coincidences often occurred at moments of psychological transformation, moments when consciousness and unconsciousness aligned. To Jung, synchronicity was evidence that the psyche was not confined to the brain, but woven into the fabric of reality itself. The publication of Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle would later become one of his most important contributions to psychology, though many contemporaries were baffled by it. Some scientists dismissed it. Some philosophers misunderstood it. But Jung did not attempt to defend himself against criticism. He believed that the spiritual dimension of human life could not be measured with instruments or captured entirely through reason. During these years, Jung also became deeply interested in UFO sightings, which were growing increasingly common in the 1950s. He did not interpret them as literal extraterrestrial craft, but as modern myth, archetypal symbols arising at a time when society had lost its orientation. In the circular shape of flying saucers, Jung saw mandalas, representations of the self, appearing in the skies because humanity felt inwardly fragmented. The world, Jung believed, was projecting its longing for wholeness onto the heavens. As Jung's ideas expanded, so did his influence. Scholars travelled from across the world to hear him speak. His books were translated into dozens of languages. Yet despite this growing recognition, Jung retreated more and more to Bollingen. He spent weeks there in quiet solitude, carving stones, painting mandalas, and reflecting on the lessons of his life. He wrote that Bollingen felt like a place where time slowed, where the self could breathe. He slept in a simple bed, woke with the birds, walked barefoot through the grass, and spent hours sitting by the lake, watching the sunlight ripple on the water. Here, he felt closest to the ancient forces he had spent his life studying. The tower was more than a home. It was a symbol of psychic wholeness. With each stone he added, Jung felt he was building his own inner structure as well. Emma Jung, his wife, remained a steady presence during these years, though her health began to fail. Their relationship, complex yet enduring, had weathered decades of challenges. Despite all the storms, their bond deepened as they grew older. Emma supported Jung's work with unwavering loyalty, and Jung, in turn, cherished her strength and wisdom. When she died in 1955, after a long illness, Jung was devastated. He wrote that half of his psychological foundation had vanished. Friends and students noticed a quiet grief settling over him, a tenderness in his voice when he spoke of her. Jung retreated for a time into Bollingen, seeking solace in solitude once more. In that loneliness, however, he found something unexpected, a renewed sense of inner light. Grief, he realized, was not merely a wound but a transformation, the psyche's way of reorganizing itself after loss. Emma had been his partner in both life and inner work, and her absence compelled him to go deeper into the symbolic dimension, seeking not escape from pain but meaning within it. In the wake of her death, Jung sensed more clearly than ever that his time was finite. He began organizing his writings, refining his teachings, and preparing his ideas for posterity. He felt a responsibility to ensure that future generations would not misunderstand the essence of his work. To Jung, analytical psychology was not a doctrine, not a fixed system, not a collection of clinical techniques. It was a pathway, a guide for anyone seeking wholeness, a map of the soul. He wanted people to understand that individuation was not perfection, but integration. Not becoming righteous or pure, but becoming whole, including the shadow, including the irrational, including the pain. And he believed, more earnestly than ever, that healing the world required healing the individual. That the horrors of the 20th century had not arisen from political abstractions, but from the neglected depths of millions of human souls. By the mid-1950s, Jung stood at the threshold of old age, his hair white, his posture slowed, his voice softer. Yet his mind remained brilliantly alive. Visitors remarked that speaking with him felt like speaking to someone who straddled two worlds, the visible world of everyday life and the invisible world of myth and symbol. He had the rare ability to sit in silence with a person and reveal, with a single question, the hidden architecture of their inner world. And so Jung entered his final decade, not withdrawn from the world, but more deeply connected to it than ever, aware that the shadows of the past still lingered, aware that new challenges lay ahead for humanity, and aware that his life's work had only scratched the surface of the psyche's mysteries. But he also felt peace, because he had walked the full circle of the self. Part 9, The Final Circle of Wisdom, 1955-1961. After Emma's death in 1955, a hush settled over Jung's life, like the stillness after a long storm. He moved through the rooms of his home with a gentler, slower rhythm, as though listening for echoes of the life they had shared. For Jung, grief did not come as an eruption, but as a lingering shadow, a soft weight on the heart that accompanied him everywhere. But in that silence, something unexpected awakened, a deeper clarity, a reflective peace that arose not from detachment, but from having lived fully, suffered deeply, and understood the psyche in ways few ever had. Emma had been his anchor, the person who had quietly held the edges of his world together while he journeyed through the depths of the unconscious. Now, without her presence, Jung felt both exposed and strangely liberated, as though standing alone on a great mountain, with the vast landscape of his life visible beneath him. He often retreated to his tower in Bollingen, where he found comfort in stone, water, and earth, elements that spoke to him without words. The lake remained his silent companion, reflecting the shifting sky like a mirror of the soul. He spent long days sitting by the water, his hands folded, his gaze distant. Those who visited him during these years said there was something luminous about him, a depth of presence that made them feel both seen and entirely at peace. Jung himself sensed that he was nearing the final steps of his life's journey. His body had grown fragile, his breath shorter, his heart prone to sudden stutters. But his mind, his brilliant, symbolic, ever-curious mind, continued to explore the mysteries of existence with undimmed intensity. In these late years, Jung became a man increasingly drawn to synthesis. He wanted to gather the threads of his life's work, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the journey of individuation, the meaning of synchronicity, and weave them into a coherent whole. Though he had written many books, he felt that much of what he had discovered still remained between the lines, in images, symbols, and experiences that could not be captured entirely through language. The psyche, he often said, was not a concept to be proven, but a reality to be lived. Visitors from around the world continued to make their way to Küsnacht, hoping to speak with him in the twilight of his life. Scholars, artists, theologians, students, they arrived with notebooks or trembling hands, eager for his insights. Jung welcomed them with kindness, though his energy was limited. He listened carefully, always with the same profound attention he had shown throughout his life. But now his answers were shorter, distilled to their essence, as though he no longer felt the need to justify or elaborate. He spoke as one who had reached the summit and could now see the landscape in its entirety. One such visitor, an American psychologist, later wrote, "Speaking to Jung felt like speaking to a man who had already crossed the boundary between worlds and returned with a lantern." Jung never claimed such things, but he acknowledged that his experiences during his near-death state had changed him. He felt that the boundary between the physical world and the world of the psyche was far thinner than most people realized. He believed that consciousness extended beyond life, not in a simplistic sense of personal immortality, but as part of a larger pattern, a cosmic tapestry of meaning. During these years, Jung worked on his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, dictating much of it to his trusted assistant, Agnella Jaffe. The book was not an autobiography in the traditional sense. It was a window into the evolution of his inner world, a symbolic journey through the major milestones, crises, and revelations that had shaped him. In those recollections, he returned often to childhood, to the haunting dreams, the division of personalities, the strange presences in his family home. He believed that early encounters with the unconscious had marked him forever, as though destiny had tapped him on the shoulder before he could even speak. He also spoke openly about his visions, his dialogues with inner figures, his encounters with the archetypes during the Red Book years. For much of his life, he had feared that sharing these experiences would lead people to mistake him for a mystic or madman. Now, near the end, he felt freer. He believed the world was finally ready to accept the idea that the psyche was vast, mysterious, and ultimately real. In conversations with Jaffe and others, Jung reflected deeply on the meaning of individuation, the process he saw as the central task of human life. Individuation was not self-improvement or ethical refinement, but the unfolding of the whole personality, the integration of all its parts, the ego, the shadow, the anima or animus, the archetypes, and the self. This journey was often painful, requiring confrontation with one's deepest fears and illusions, but it led to a profound sense of wholeness. "People will do anything," Jung once remarked, "no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." He had seen this truth in individuals and in nations. Many chose distraction, repression, or projection rather than the difficult work of self-understanding. But he believed that the future of humanity depended on individuals willing to walk this inner path. If enough people could integrate their shadows, perhaps the horrors of the 20th century would not repeat themselves. His thoughts during these years often turned to the question of God, not God as a theological doctrine, but God as an experience, an archetype, a symbol of the self. Jung's ideas about religion had always been complex. He did not dismiss faith, but he insisted that religious truths must be rooted in inner experience, not external authority. To Jung, God was a psychological reality, an expression of the deepest layers of the psyche, the centre toward which all individuation moved. He saw the divine not as distant, but as intimately woven into the unconscious. In his later writings, Jung increasingly emphasized that modern people suffered from loss of soul, a disconnection from meaning, from inner guidance, from the mythic dimension of life. And he feared that without reconnecting to this dimension, the technological advances of humanity would lead only to alienation and spiritual emptiness. He warned that a civilization that worships rationality alone risks becoming spiritually barren. These reflections became central to one of his most important late works, Answer to Job. In this controversial book, Jung explored the biblical story not as theology, but as myth, a symbolic narrative that revealed profound truths about the evolution of consciousness. He argued that humanity's moral awareness had grown over time, and that even the divine image in human consciousness had evolved alongside it. Many theologians were shocked, some even outraged, but Jung felt he had spoken an essential truth, that the relationship between humans and the divine was a dynamic psychological process. Throughout the 1950s, Jung continued to build, paint, and carve at Bollingen. He added inscriptions to the stones, Latin phrases, alchemical symbols, mandalas. These carvings were not decorations but embodiments of inner realities. He believed that working with stone grounded him, linked him to the earth, and allowed his unconscious to express itself through his hands. The tower grew with him, each new room symbolizing another stage of his journey. One of his last carvings at Bollingen was a circular stone engraved with a mandala surrounded by the inscription Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or uncalled, God will be present. This phrase had appeared to Jung earlier in life, and he felt it summarized his entire experience, that the divine, the self, the centre of the psyche, appeared whether one sought it or not. As the decade progressed, Jung's health grew increasingly fragile. He experienced periods of intense fatigue, and his heart struggled under the weight of age. Yet even then, he continued to receive visitors, though more sparingly. Each conversation seemed to hold the weight of final teachings. He spoke of the importance of imagination, of dreams, of symbolic understanding. He reminded people that the unconscious was not an enemy to be feared, but a guide to be befriended. In early 1961, Jung suffered a small stroke. His speech slowed, his body weakened, but his mind remained lucid, serene, and full of symbolic insight. He spent his final weeks at home in Küsnacht, surrounded by familiar objects, family members, and the quiet presence of the lake. He spoke softly about dreams he continued to have, dreams filled with radiant light and expansive landscapes. In one of his last recorded statements, he remarked, "I have done my best to understand the riddles of the world. I have tried to open a door." By now he knew his final days were approaching. He felt no fear, only acceptance, a sense of returning to the great mystery he had glimpsed during his near-death experience. He imagined death not as an ending, but as a transition, a continuation of the psyche's journey beyond the confines of earthly life. On June 6, 1961, Carl Gustav Jung passed away peacefully in his home, aged 85. Those present remarked on the tranquility of the room, as though a profound stillness had descended at the moment of his passing. He left behind a vast legacy of writings, insights, and teachings, treasures that would shape psychology, spirituality, and culture for generations to come. But his greatest legacy was not any single book or theory. It was the path he had walked, the courage to explore the unconscious, the humility to face his own shadow, the wisdom to integrate the many parts of himself, and the compassion to help others do the same. Jung understood, perhaps better than anyone, that meaning is not something found, but something created. Through self-exploration, through dreams, through dialogue between consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche. And he believed, until his final breath, that every individual carried within them a spark of the self, a guiding light capable of healing, transforming, and enriching the world. His journey had come full circle, but the map he left behind, the map of the human soul, remains as relevant today as ever. Part 10, The Everlasting Shadow and the Light Ahead, a final reflection. In the years following Jung's death in 1961, the world continued to change with a velocity and complexity he had anticipated, but could never have fully witnessed. Civil rights movements rose, wars unfolded, technologies advanced, and humanity stepped into the digital age. Yet through all this transformation, his ideas about the unconscious, about symbols, about the shadow within each of us, remained like quiet constellations in the background of modern life, guiding those who sought meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. And though Jung himself was gone, the influence of his thinking rippled outward, crossing borders, cultures, and generations. Scholars took up his work with renewed energy. Analysts trained in the discipline he had founded. Artists read his writings and found themselves painting dreamscapes they had never dared imagine. Writers discovered metaphors buried in their own psyches that mirrored Jung's archetypes with uncanny precision. Even ordinary people, not trained in psychology, but drawn to inner life, found comfort in his insights about the soul, about dreams that whispered truths we were not ready to hear in the daylight, about symbols that hovered at the edges of consciousness. For many who encountered his work, Jung's ideas felt less like inventions and more like rediscoveries, ancient truths re-emerging through a modern voice. And so, as we step into this concluding part of Jung's story, let us imagine him not as the elderly man in his study, nor as the brilliant psychiatrist lecturing in Zurich, nor even as the lonely seeker carving stones at Bollingen, but as something broader. Let us see him as a man who ventured fearlessly into the depths of the psyche, who brought back insights that continue to shape us long after his passing, and who offered humanity a map for navigating its inner landscape. For if there is something that Jung understood perhaps better than anyone of his era, it was that the greatest challenges we face, individually and collectively, are not external but internal. The world is made from the inside out. This final chapter is not just about Jung's legacy, but about the timelessness of his message, a message that whispers through the decades. Know your shadow. Integrate it. Become whole. Let us turn now to the deeper currents of that legacy. After Jung's death, many of his followers found themselves returning again and again to Bollingen, to the tower he had built with his own hands. The tower had become a kind of pilgrimage site, a physical testament to Jung's inner journey. Its stones held fragments of his life story, carvings of serpents, mandalas, runes, mythic images that seemed to shimmer when sunlight struck the walls. The circular rooms felt timeless, as though the walls themselves were listening. Visitors described a curious sensation, that even in his absence, Jung's presence was palpable. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as an atmosphere. A quiet, contemplative awareness that encouraged stillness and reflection. For many who entered the tower, it felt like stepping inside someone's mind, a mind profoundly attuned to the symbolic layers of existence. That tower stood as a reminder of Jung's belief that the psyche is not an abstract concept, but something that can be built, shaped, carved, and lived. Individuation is not merely a psychological theory, it is a lived experience, a journey that unfolds across a lifetime, written not only in dreams, but in the choices we make, the relationships we form, the suffering we endure, and the symbols we follow. As the decades passed, Jung's ideas seeped deeper into culture. Filmmakers used archetypes to craft stories that resonated across the world. Novelists wove his concepts into narratives of self-discovery and moral struggle. Musicians turned his theories into lyrics, and psychoanalysts carried his work into new territories. Cross-cultural psychology, religious studies, depth analysis, trauma therapy. But Jung had always insisted that his ideas were not dogma. He hoped that others would take them, test them, challenge them, and expand them. And that is precisely what happened. For Jung's work was never meant to be a rigid system. It was a map, a lantern, a compass pointing to the deep interior world that modern life tends to ignore. And beneath all his theories lies one fundamental message. The unconscious is not the enemy. This was Jung's gift to humanity. The radical, compassionate belief that the darker aspects of the psyche, the anger, the fear, the envy, the impulses we hide, are not forces to be destroyed, but parts of ourselves that long for acknowledgement, healing and integration. Jung believed that confronting the darkness within us is the only path to genuine peace. Without that confrontation, the shadow leaks outwards, shaping our actions in ways we cannot recognize, projecting our inner conflicts onto others. He saw this not as poetry, but as psychological law. And as the 20th century progressed, Jung's warning about the collective shadow proved heartbreakingly prescient. Wars erupted, ideologies clashed, civilizations rose and faltered. Each conflict bore the unmistakable signature of projections, the tendency to blame others for the darkness we cannot see in ourselves. Yet Jung's teachings also offered a way forwards. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim one's humanity. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim one's power. To integrate the shadow is to step onto the path of wholeness. And it is here, in the heart of this truth, that Jung's legacy becomes not only the story of a man, but the story of every human life. Imagine Jung in his final months. An elderly man with white hair, sitting in his garden overlooking Lake Zurich. The water glimmers softly in the late afternoon light. Birds wander across the lawn. The leaves rustle in a gentle wind, carrying scents of grass and earth. His breath is slow, his heartbeat unsteady, but his eyes remain as bright. Visitors arrive sometimes, speaking with him in hushed tones, aware that they are in the presence of someone whose insight has changed the course of modern thought. But Jung himself does not dwell on his accomplishments. He knows that everything he has written is merely a doorway, an invitation for others to explore their own depths. He reflects instead on the dreams he had as a child, the mysterious figures, the hidden presences, the overwhelming visions of the sacred and the terrifying. He sees now that those dreams were the seedlings of his life's work, the whispered guidance of a psyche that always knew where it needed to go. He thinks of the years with Freud, the friendship, the excitement, the fracture, the pain. He recognizes that without that rupture, he never would have discovered the collective unconscious, never would have traced the symbolic architecture of the psyche. The pain had been a necessary doorway. He thinks of the war years, of the nightmares shared by millions, of the shadow rising with such destructive force. He grieves for the lives lost, but takes solace in the fact that humanity, shaken by its own darkness, had begun to seek new forms of meaning. And he thinks of Emma, of her steady presence beside him, her patience, her brilliance, her quiet strength. He knows that she had been the true foundation of his life. Her death had cracked him open, but through that crack, a new light had entered. He remembers, too, the visions he had during his near-death experience, the sensation of floating above the earth, the brilliant light radiating from beyond the threshold of life. He had returned changed, softened, humbled, aware that human consciousness was only a fragment of something larger. And there, in that garden, Jung understands something he had always sensed but never fully articulated, that the psyche is not inside us. We are inside the psyche. Human life unfolds like a dream within a vast living field of meaning, an ancient, mysterious reality filled with symbols, patterns and possibilities. The unconscious is not beneath us, but around us. the self is not a destination, but an ever-shifting horizon of growth. As Jung breathes the cool evening air, he feels his life settling into a perfect circle, not a tidy narrative, but a mandala, each chapter a fragment of a larger design. He has walked through madness and returned with wisdom. He has studied myth and found psychology woven into its threads. He has studied psychology and found myth woven into its truths. He has sought meaning in darkness and found it illuminated from within. When Jung dies in June 1961, Switzerland mourns quietly. His family gathers in the garden. His students light candles. His tower at Bollingen stands in stillness, its stones warm in the summer sun. And the lake, gentle and reflective, continues to shimmer as though nothing has happened. And yet, everything has. For Jung's legacy is not buried with him. It breathes in every person who dares to explore their dreams. It whispers through every conflict that forces someone to face their shadow. It glows in every symbol that stirs the soul without explanation. It rises in every moment of synchronicity that reminds us the world is alive with meaning. It lives wherever someone begins the journey toward wholeness. And so, dear friend, as we end this long, calming journey through Jung's life, perhaps the most important message he left us is simply this: do not fear the darkness within you. For inside that darkness lies a voice waiting to be heard, a truth waiting to be seen, and a light waiting to be embraced. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the doorway to the whole of who you are. And perhaps, in the quiet moments before sleep, when dreams begin to stir and the unconscious opens like a night sky, Jung's words might guide you gently inward. Only in our darkness can we truly see the light. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through the life of Carl Jung, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more calming, reflective bedtime biographies. Your support helps us continue creating these soothing stories, and we'd love to hear in the comments which figure you'd like us to explore next. Sleep well, dear friend.